I don't know about you guys, but after Craig's talk, I'm ready to drop everything I'm working on, just do food security all the time. I really have enjoyed today, and it's actually one of the real pleasures of, being a president of the AAEA is the breadth of the association. So, we talked about everything about, where does, the farmer's decision of how to use data on their farm, where do they get their labor, what countries do we send these products to, and now we're talking about how do people eat it. And, so our profession is really diverse, and I think it's one of our real strengths. When I think about our priorities and solutions, that's one of the things that I think, we should emphasize is most of us can walk down the hall to a colleague who is working on something very different, but those linkages we have that can link things all the way back from the food consumer, back to the farm level, back to something that's happening, halfway across the world. That is something that I think a lot of disciplines really don't have and is a real strength. That being said, I'm going to make the case that the demand side of this food equation has been increasing in importance and will be increasing in importance in terms of the things that we are asked to do and probably where our funding opportunities will lie. So this is data that you all know, but if you look back over 100 years, back before about 1950, there were between 6 and 7 million farms. Now we're at about 2 million, and really it's a lot less than that. So if you calculate the number of farms that produce the top 80% of the value of ag output, there's only about 160,000 of those farms. And at the same time, though, the population, that's the red line, has continued to increase. So in other words, we have a lot more eaters that are a lot more disconnected with the folks who are producing the food. And I think that's produced a whole bunch of interesting challenges and a lot of opportunities for us too. We also have a lot of entrants into this space, I think, that care about food consumption and things that happen on the farm. These are, calls for new and even revolutionary types of food systems, from best-selling books to our former First Lady, all kinds of certification programs, new NGOs. And when the New York Times starts hosting, food policy conferences, that's awesome, except we weren't invited. But these are great opportunities, I think, for us, and folks care and want to know about, about the food system, and we, I think, have important things to say about it. So what I thought I'd do is just share some of my thoughts on some of these priority areas that Jill read off, and Jill and I actually wrote a paper together that Craig will hopefully publish, depending on what those reviewers say. But I just thought I'd share some of my own thoughts about why some of these issues are important and some of the things that economists can do, I think, to help study some of these issues. So I know Craig said it's not all that important, but I think the issue is, I think that, these issues related to dietary-related disease are big. And they're costly. We can debate about whether these are externalities or to what extent they're market failures. We can fight about that, but the issue is it is costly at the individual level and maybe even at the societal level. And I think, the logical train of thought here is, a lot of these dietary-related diseases, obesity, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, these depend, at least in part, they're complex phenomenon, but at least they depend in part on what people eat. And then what people eat, of course, depend on food prices, income, environment. Apparently, according to David, also arrows on the floor and little signs that the grocery store puts up. These are things that we, as economists, should know something about and be able to have something to say. But I think more importantly than that, one of the things I think that our disciplinary training can do is help provide insights into the consequences of various food policy decisions. So I'm just going to give you several examples here. And maybe it's the things that people advocating for policies don't like, but I think one of the best things we can do sometimes is tell people what won't work. It's better to spend our time on things that will than things that won't. So just to give you a flavor, I think, of some of the unintuitive things that people often don't think about. So we should ban advertising of quote-unquote junk food to children, right? Seems like an obvious benefit. It seems like that it's clear what will happen, except, according to my French colleagues, they said, well, what happens when these companies have this extra money to spend? Instead of spending on advertising, what are they going to do instead if they can't compete on advertising with Tony the Tiger and the Fruit Loops, bird? Well, one of the things they may do is they may start investing in cost-cutting technologies and then lower the price of our cereals and sodas, therefore increasing consumption of these things. Another study we have that's coming out of the Economic Journal, it's I think in discussions with nutritionists and epidemiologists, well, they say just change the prices. That's all you need to do, right? tax the things that are unhealthy, subsidize the things that aren't. We can do that. Those things will have some effect, although there's a lot of substitution effects. But one of the things, the unintended consequences there is it actually could exacerbate a lot of these inequality issues. The reason is that high-income people are already eating the things we want them to, so when you subsidize the healthy things, you're sending money to people that are already relatively well off, and when you tax the unhealthy things, you're now disadvantaging the people that are already, relatively lower on the economic strata. Moreover, we find somewhat counterintuitively that lower income people sometimes don't respond as much, so perhaps a little more habit prone. So not only are we taxing a group of people that sometimes can't afford it, they're not going to change their behavior as much sometimes, which is perhaps a little counterintuitive. I know Craig has no opinions about this, but there are a lot of discussions about policies related to SNAP that sounds obvious and intuitive. We're just going to prohibit SNAP recipients from buying sodas, except that our economic reasoning suggests actually will have no effect. They're just going to take one thing that's on this side of the little bar at your checkout line, replace it with something else, and theoretically would expect to have no effect, but it could affect participation rates, which is a potential problem. I think one of the things that hopefully economists can do in this area is give advice or provide insights into how, given that we're going to have a policy, how can we make it more effective? So these are just examples of studies from the literature. So for example, excise taxes probably would do a better job at reducing soda consumption than sales taxes. Why? At least in the US, the sales tax is not on the posted price when you go to the grocery store. So we're not behaviorally as responsive to it. Another suggestion is that taxes just based on calories are probably likely to be more effective than, say, for example, taxes based on the number of ounces of soda, for example. I've worked on some studies with my colleague Brenda Ellison, who's at Illinois, that if we're going to have a law that mandates restaurants put calories on their menu, by the way, just putting the calories probably isn't going to have much effect, according to most of our studies, include these studies we've done in grocery stores. But perhaps some symbolic type labels might matter a lot more. Also, a lot of the farm kind of interventions to affect dietary choice probably aren't going to have much of an impact. Why? Because the farm share of the retail dollar is really small. This is a big issue. It came up a bunch today. It came up in Tom's discussion, but this, what we might call trust in the food system, I think is a really big issue. Economists don't believe in free lunches, but innovation and productivity growth are the closest thing to a free lunch that we believe in, I think. And we know from a bunch of our colleagues' research that the returns to research and agriculture are really high, but all this innovation is only valuable if people are going to buy it at the end of the day. And if they won't, or if they're going to pass policies that prohibit these innovations, they don't produce any value. So I think we have to get a better understanding of what it is that people distrust in our food system. So I think a key challenge really for agriculture in general is, how do we increase the sustainability, increase productivity of our food system, meet this growing demand, but do it in a way that people actually will accept, that they will appreciate. I think that's going to be a real key challenge and something I think as food economists can help provide insights into. I do a survey every month of 1,000 US food consumers. I asked this question in a survey a couple months ago, and I just asked, what do you think about the state of food and agriculture? Is it getting better or worse? If I add together much worse, a little worse, and things are the same at 75% of people. I think our food system today is either just a little better or worse. That's a real big issue. I'm going to skip over this. So I think, in thinking about this acceptance of new farm and food technologies, what is it that's driving this gap between the public perception and sort of the scientific perception? Sometimes people say, well, we just need to educate consumers. But actually, that model of communication also doesn't hold anymore. There's a lot of research to suggest, sort of behavioral economic research. We seek out the information we want. We seek out to confirm our biases. We're going to only listen to people we already trust and these sorts of things. I think there's also questions about sort of what I might call the politicization of food. And the use of, say, direct ballot initiatives where people vote to ban practices that have these effects on farmers. I think Warren mentioned that earlier. And so it puts kind of an unfunded mandate on producers sometimes. We're going to pass a policy prohibiting you to use a certain technology, but we've already told you through our market interactions we're not willing to pay the premium for those other products. So I think those are all big issues. I think the environmental impacts of food consumption is something that's really growing in interest and important. Jill already mentioned, life cycle analysis is sort of the workhorse, but does it tell us anything about value and what people care about? I think meat consumption effects are things that are really going to be in the news, are not going to go away, particularly whenever we talk about development issues. Food waste is an issue growing in interest. One thing I think we need to do as economists is most of the stuff that I've read that we produce is what I would call the accounting of food waste, not the economics of food waste. Why do we waste food in the first place? Often it's a rational thing to do given prices and incomes and various constraints. If people want to change that, I think we need to understand the underlying causal mechanisms, not just calculate the percentage of food wasted. This is just a slide to say, Jill also mentioned the priority areas related to quality issues and labels and these sorts of things. I think we tend to think, well, that's sort of the private sector's deal. But if we aren't paying attention to the things that consumers care about, that's going to be a problem. So this is over 4 years of data from these monthly surveys I do. So every data point there is 1,000 people. And I just ask them, what are the most important things to you when you buy food? And they essentially have to rank them. And for over 4 years, the top 4 things are taste, safety, price, and nutrition. But if we aren't working on taste and we aren't paying attention to what people are paying for food, we're not paying attention to the things consumers themselves care about. I mean, it's not like they don't, and all these other things like origin, environment, fairness. I mean, they care about it. It's just these other things are just much more important to the average person. So I'm going to just wrap up with one last thing here, and that is to say, I think there's been a theme here about what are the challenges we have in addressing these issues, and I think a really big challenge on this consumer side is data. And all our surveys are perfect, right? This was 538, right before the election that we just witnessed, and they got it exactly right. We'll go talk about President Clinton here in a minute. But surveys we found are fallible. And the challenge is almost everything that we know about food consumption patterns are based on surveys. And what unfortunately we also know is people don't always accurately tell us what they eat. We can use scanner data, but I think Stacy talked about this. There's problems with scanner data too. It's not representative. It's got all kinds of inferential challenges. It doesn't tell us anything about what people eat away from home, which is half of food expenditures these days. So I think that's going to be a real big issue, is linking. How do we find out what consumers are actually doing, and linking that back with nutritional data and farm level data so we can estimate environmental impacts are, I think, in my mind, some of the most important things. So I'll stop there. You can buy one of my books too. That would be good.